Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of UAP Studies. I'm joined today by none other than Katie Paige is joining us. As you know, Katie, we've had her on before. She lives in Colorado and she's a MUFON state director. She's also part of the Star Investigation team and a host of other teams. Katie, can you name off all the teams that you're part of?
Oh, well, I headed up the Mars team, which we're going to have big news coming out at this year's symposium, which is in a few weeks. So this has been, the Mars stands for the MUFON Archive Research and Redacting Team. And before pre-CMS, all the computerized cases, MUFON since 1969 has thousands upon thousands of cases that were all on paper. So we spent, 3.5 years. Debbie Ziegelmeyer actually headed it up at the beginning. But long story short, this will finally eventually be out there after the new year for the public to be able to see all those old archived historical cases. And it's super, super exciting. It's about time that's done. So I'm happy to be part of that.
Yeah, you know what? Bring it on. The more information that we have coming forward, especially with Congress looking into this, the more research we can show them that says, "Hey, this dates back a long time." That's a good thing. And joined today, of course, by Christopher O'Brien. Christopher is an investigator and researcher that's been looking into cattle mutilations as well as weird, strange phenomenon on different ranches and different locations for quite some time. He's written a book that is basically the Bible of cattle mutilations called Stalking the Herd, which came out in 2015, and it's the most comprehensible book ever written on the subject of cattle mutilations. Now, he's appeared on more than 70 TV shows and segments and documentaries, including radio shows, recently Tucker Carlson and Ancient Aliens. I'm not as good as the intros as I used to be. His investigations, of course, have been featured on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, BBC, Travel Channel, and Nat Geo, of course, and a slew of others. He's just been everywhere. But he joins us today from his home, and we're going to talk about some interesting subjects today. But we've been covering a lot of cattle mutilation, guys, as of late, and it's my honor to have both you guys on to talk about this very serious subject, which also has a dark side to it, which we will mention later on in the episode. But first and foremost, thank you, Christopher, for joining us today.
Sure. Yeah. I've been looking forward to this for a while. Too bad Luis isn't here. Is it Luis or Louis?
Louis.
Louis.
Yeah.
Okay. I kind of got it right.
Yeah. No, he had to write it different.
I've been a bit of a fan of you guys. I've caught several of your shows, and of course, Katie is my new besties out there in Colorado. She's really been doing an amazing job getting people up to speed on that crazy Colorado ranch case that I've known about since she was a little girl. I literally, we were talking about this prior to rolling the show here, and I mentioned that I think it was 79 that I first heard about the case, and then it was 89 or 87, I think, when I first talked to somebody who had been involved with the case. And then by 90, I had talked with most of the principal investigators of the case, none of which were willing to give up the name of the family or ID the exact location of the ranch, which always impressed me and was one of the things that I was compelled by when asked by others about some of my cases, where I was told, no, the principal witnesses are not interested in sharing the information with anybody, even other investigators. And it was that case that really gave me the sense that, hey, that this was this request for anonymity was really important. And it was your case that really set me on a path of never divulging anything that somebody didn't want divulged. And that's I think one of the most important ground rules that we have as investigators out there, dealing with people that have been dealing with unusual experiences and that may be compromising within their communities. And so that's something I wanted to bring up right quickly at the onset here.
Well, Chris, all that coming from you is a complete honor. I have my deepest respect for you and your years of research into this topic. So that just means a lot to me. And you're right. You're absolutely right. Respecting people's anonymity is so important. However, from my perspective, I felt decades have gone by. I have personal ties to the ranch, and the 11 plus years I've done research on the Clearview case. I thought it was about time that the true location of the
I'm so
property
happy you did.
was
Because this was
known
the one
because-
case that I wanted more than any other case to know who the principals were, where where the actual location was. And I mean that. I'm not making this up. I mean, this case was a big deal for me for a lot of years, and was one of the ones that I badgered Leo Sprinkle more than any other case. Tom Adams, I badgered him. David Perkins. David didn't know where it was. He said, "Well, I could guess, but I know that's not going to work for you."
No, just for the record, guys, this predates Skinwalker Ranch. Is that correct?
No, I'm talking about 1979.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when I first heard about it, and then I first got involved with individuals that I was able to figure out who it was that went out there and did some investigation work based on the book by Timothy Good. Yeah. What was it? I forget. It was his book that he released, I think, in '87.
Above Top Secret.
Above Top Secret. Thank you. That's where I first really found out about who was involved with the Clearview case. I had heard about it through the grapevine prior to that, but this was one of the cases that I felt could be the most important case that we have prior to the Skinwalker Ranch case, which I was most people don't know this, but I was the very first person to go up there before. In fact, I supplied Terry Sherman with Robert Bigelow's phone number and the phone number for Lawrence Rockefeller, because he was so freaked out by what was going on up there that he wanted to sell the ranch, but he wanted to sell it to somebody that would actually do good science. And so when I was informed about the ranch before the first article came out, in the Deseret News, written by Zach Van Eck, Zach called me and said, "Hey, there's this rancher who could really use somebody to talk to before this whole thing hits the publicity and the fan. Could you help me out and talk to this guy?" And I, not only did I help him out, I literally dropped everything and I drove 450 miles up there. Wow. And spent the whole afternoon with him. Thinking that this was going to be the beginning of a long distance case, but one that I was going to be really involved with for years. I mean, this was the case that I had been waiting for to bring me out of the San Luis Valley. Every other case I'd investigated had been within the confines of the greater San Luis Valley, and this was the first one that the Skinwalker Ranch case was the first one to bring me outside of the valley. So I don't know how we got started on that, but yeah, I've been at this for a while. I've been a lifelong follower of the subject. I was an experiencer. I was followed around my neighborhood at 3 a.m. by non-human entities, 1966. There were 3-4 other cases around in towns around my town, investigated by John Keel. I found out many, many years later. And when I moved to Colorado, I didn't realize that I'd moved into a hotspot area that was still cranking along. Basically, I figured everything had ceased and stopped, and that there really wasn't that much going on when I moved there in 1989. From the East Coast, and much to my surprise, things were going on, and I ended up, for 10 solid years, I put 300,000 miles on my truck. Wow. I investigated over 1,000 cases, whether they be cattle mutilations, whether they be UFO sightings, crypto reports. all the things that go bump in the night that we love to talk about. So here I am, all these years later, now talking with Katie here publicly for the first time,
Yeah.
about a case that just totally fascinated me 40 years ago.
But see, there's an amazing thing here is that one, you've had experiences that led you to want to investigate. You ended up investigating Katie's case, where she was an experiencer and things were happening to her. So it seems like people that are affected by this phenomenon, yes, we cycle and we help each other
Oh,
out.
yeah.
We investigate each other's cases. It's amazing. But the thing is, does it take people to have experiencers? Like, as we were talking, people in the CIA, they're experiencers as well. They want answers as much as we do. So I think it's a huge thing that you're stepping up to the plate and you're doing the right thing. Even it's like I'm sorry, but you must have not made much money doing this at all. Knowing what the industry is like, I don't think you made a cent,
You
right?
must
Yeah.
be joking.
Yeah. So, but it's amazing because you've helped, in that donation of your time and efforts, you've helped people. That's a huge thing, that not many people can die saying that. You know what I mean? Like that's the point of life, is to help people, right?
It's a really difficult job, but somebody's got to do it. And unfortunately, I've gotten a reputation of being rather surly and curmudgeonly, and some people think that I'm a debunker even, because I am so down on what passes as investigation and research in this field nowadays. Especially in the last 5 or 6 years, since the nefarious, notorious New York Times, Ralph Blumenthal, Leslie Kean article that was published in December 2017. We have a lot of people that are now new to the field and are not up to speed, have not done due diligence like the three of us have. I have an entire, I don't know how many thousands of books that I have, and I've read most of them twice, some as many as 5 times.
That's crazy.
And we're just seeing a lot of, Johnny come latelys, just add water and they're instant experts. And it's just,
I hate that, the expert title. I hate that.
I have a real problem with people that don't know what the hell they're talking about. And, I know Katie's put some time in on this. I know you have too, Jason, but I've really put the time in. And, I'm going on 35 years now of being an active investigator. And it really behooves me to see people ruin cases, ruin, just the whole idea of what it is to actually get people to open up who have had tremendously life-altering experiences, and to stumble into their lives and make it worse is not my idea of a good bedside manner and a good investigative technique. It's just not. And I've been toying around with the idea of actually writing a book for people who want to get into this a little bit more, than just being an armchair researcher. But I don't want to encourage anybody. I don't want to encourage anybody to get involved in this, because there's no upside to it, except for maybe the feeling that you've helped somebody, that somebody really relies on you and can call you and say, "Oh my God, I need to talk to you right now." People ask me to define what it is that I do, and I say I'm a paranormal shrink. Basically, I'm there for people. I cultivate relationships with individuals that have had unusual experiences, and I help them put it into some sort of context, and I help them come to grips with the implications of these things, not only to them personally, but the implications for humankind. I mean, when I went up to to visit Terry Sherman at Skinwalker Ranch and spent the afternoon with him, thinking that this was going to be the beginning of a very wonderful relationship, which it wasn't. I only was able to spend time with him on the phone for another month, and then I got shut down because of the non-disclosure agreement that he signed. When I went up there, it was the first time I really saw what it's like to have these types of experiences really shake your faith in your reality. And people ask, I see people say, well, this is all just a bunch of bull. That guy didn't have anything happen. He was up there. They made all this stuff up. No, no, they didn't. Maybe they misinterpreted certain things, or maybe they misread certain things. Maybe they were presented with a certain set of stimuli, and it registered as something else. But there's definitely something going on up there, and I don't care who you are or how badly you dislike, how much you dislike the television show and all these, the spin-offs that are now being spun off the whole concept up there. But
yeah.
I met a man up there that was really terrified, and I've met too many people out in the field. I've talked to too many ranchers. I've talked to too many farmers. I've talked to too many law enforcement people, too many investigators to get fooled. You can't fool me. And he did not even try to fool me. He was as genuine as any person I've ever seen in this field. And I was willing to go the extra mile from the man to get him out of there, basically. That's what he had me up there to do, was show me around, tell me some of the things that had happened, and then try to get him off that ranch so he could, he was in fear of the safety of his family.
Yeah. People don't
that
understand
really speaks
that.
volumes.
Yeah. People don't understand that sometimes, even for me personally, Chris, is, this has been a process for me, because since I also experienced things on the ranch in that whole
Right.
time for me. Yes, I was a young girl, but it never leaves you. It stays with you. It's not always positive. It was terrifying at the time. And so it's like you have to research and then process and kind of, protect yourself, and then research, process. So it's a very delicate thing. And I have the utmost respect for you for treating these witnesses and being there for them. And that's something I really, really admired in Dr. Leo Sprinkle. And Chris, knew him very well. We lost him, unfortunately, recently, but he was so generous with his time and spirit. And on his deathbed, because he spent over 40 years investigating, experiencers and contactees and past life and hypnosis and all that, I asked him, you may pass away and you may not have the answers. Do you regret your lifetime's worth of work? And he said, yeehaw, in Leo style, and said, no, It's the journey. It's the people along the way. And he felt he was an ear, and he was certainly that for me. And he
was for me too. Definitely. He gave me one of my first shots, signed me up to speak at my first out-of-state conference. Awesome. Which I will always be forever grateful for him.
Thank you, Leo.
And both he and his wife were always there for me whenever I had a question that I needed to ask. Whenever I had a piece of advice that I felt that he was the person that could give it, he was there. I didn't particularly agree with some of his thinking. He was a little new agey for me at times. The older he got, the more love and light he became. Yeah. Not to say that there's something wrong with that, but it's, I guess, a good example of that would be someone who is too love and light, which would be like Stephen Greer, who says that all negative ET events, all abductions, all cattle mutilations, they're all the government, because they're the mean and nasty people, and our benevolent space brothers would never do anything like that. I don't quite agree with that, but Leo and his wife were just absolutely, they were just light bulbs going off constantly. And I almost got him to speak at a conference that I had put together. down in Palenque. I wanted to create kind of a conference sort of for the speakers, a vacation. So I got John Keel, Leo Sprinkle, Robert Anton Wilson, who turned me down, and then some of my own personal favorite investigators, Tom Adams, Gary Massey, David Perkins. And we were going to do this. I had everybody signed on. I had flights were being booked. The Changha, the hotel there in Palenque, had been booked. And I ended up having to cancel the weekend before 9/11.
Oh, no.
The conference was on 9/11. So,
Well, that's
so
a
much for
memorable
that.
date for sure.
Or
Yeah.
it was actually the weekend after 9/11. I had to cancel on 9/11
Wow.
for the conference the following week. And I lost a good deal of money on that.
Wow.
But the first person I called was Leo to speak. He was my first, the first person that I invited to speak, and he was thrilled for the chance to go down to Palenque and get reacquainted with a bunch of his investigator friends, because Tom Adams, Gary Massey, David Perkins, they had known at that point, they had known Peter for 30 years. So since the 60s. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
No.
why don't you continue?
Well, I was going to say that, Katie's a great investigator. And last time we had her on, she had a bunch of slides that's what she was showing us, and it blew our minds. We're like, oh man, we got to do this more often, right? Like get slides and people actually showing their research, because it's amazing. And I know that you've been investigating. I mean, you must be sick and tired of cows at this point. I don't think you even eat meat. There's no way you possibly could. But you've investigated
I
this.
do.
Yeah, you
I
investigated.
don't want to get
this
sued by
thoroughly,
the
right?
beef industry if I wouldn't dare say I don't eat meat.
Yeah, exactly. He wrote this book and now he's not eating
Eating
meat.
meat.
Get him, cancel him. But
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
but you've investigated this, and Katie, she's been investigating this. And so I would like just to hear the two investigators, just, I wouldn't say hash it out, that's a wrong word, but just talk about it. What have you found, Katie, in your area recently? And Chris, what are your thoughts on the recent waves that is currently happening?
Wow. One thing I can tell you is the Madison County, Texas sheriff will never announce that he's had cattle mutilations on Facebook again. I guess that would probably have the record for the most amount of response that an announcement of that sort has ever had at a county sheriff's office.
Good for tourists, right? Yeah.
Not really. I did talk with the woman who was being called the chief investigator of the cases. I only was able to speak with her once because I think she ended up getting a new phone number and it isn't on Facebook anymore. They were so inundated with interest about this. They were totally shocked by it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we had already seen quite a heightened interest in the cases that were occurring over the past 4 years in Oregon. I'm not really supposed to talk about it, but there's one ranch that's had over 200 cases.
On one ranch.
Yes.
Wow.
And of course, there was another 2 ranches had 19. But I predicted those cases. I really did. And I wish I'd written it down, or I'd had the guy I predicted it to write it down. David Perkins came up with a theory in 1979 that if you go downwind and downstream of where we utilize uranium, you will find the areas of highest incidence in the cattle mutilation mystery. So nuclear plants, uranium mines, weapons enrichment facilities, missile fields, and ballistic missile fields. If you go downwind and downstream, that's where you're going to find the highest concentrations of cattle mutilations. Well, as soon as Fukushima happened, I noted that, hey, we rarely have any cases on the West Coast, west of the Rockies. If you look at the maps, there's only a smattering of cases, several dozen, compared to the thousands of cases that happen in the Rocky Mountain region, the Midwest, and the eastern portion of the Midwest. Now all the way to Florida. We just had cases in North Carolina. We had cases in Georgia. This is all new. It's almost like chronic wasting disease. The same thing. It's all it's all east of the Rockies. Chronic wasting disease being mad cow disease in deer and elk, which is also there's a correlation there as well. So anyway, when Fukushima happened, I went to David Perkins. I said, "Look, we have this radiation bloom coming over here, and it's going to be hitting northern California and Oregon and in parts of southern Washington. It's going to nail it." And then there was another stream that came through to the south, just north of San Diego. And I said, well, if your theory is correct, then we should start seeing mutilations in Oregon. And sure enough, now I find out 2 years later, the mutilations started. I didn't know that they started until 4 years later. So I wasn't aware of this case of the 200 on the ranch. I was only aware of the 19 that happened. The 5 bulls were the main ones. So maybe there's something there. Maybe there's something to that particular theory.
Yeah.
It's the first time in my knowledge that someone has had the audacity to predict mutilation cases and where they would occur. So
I have so many questions for you, Chris, and that location that's always been my question, because out there in Elbert County, we know we have Colorado Springs and NORAD, and you did your investigations, the Mysterious Valley, the San Luis Valley, which is on the other side or the southern side of Colorado Springs. So here we have Snippy the horse, which I believe was in 1967. Is that right? Which was Lady the horse. So you have Colorado Springs with this inundated with NORAD and Camp Carson and Butte and Air Force Academy, and that you have Elbert County on this side of it, in the San Luis Valley on the other side of it. Do you think those are connected? And then of course you go into New Mexico with Dulce and the tunneling. Have you ever made those connections, Chris, with that? It's always been a question.
Yeah, I have to some extent. I think it's a multifarious equation. I think that the radiation may play part in it. I think that we popped off 100 nuclear weapons above ground at the Nevada test site, and now with this movie that's really kind of creating a bit of a storm right now. The movie about
Oppenheimer.
Yeah, Oppenheimer. I think we're seeing a rising of reinterest in above ground nuclear testing and the potential downside of that. And I think the San Luis Valley is one of those areas in this country that is pristine. It doesn't have the pollution. It's almost like it's set up perfectly to be a control group. And so I've always felt that the valley has been a control group because there is no measurable pollution in the valley. And what we're basically talking about is airborne pollution. And if that's the case, then you would need a control group. And what better place to go than the only place that has no measurable pollution? And the nearest pollution that they do have is the Alamosa River, which is trashed by a cyanide leaking leach field at the Summitville gold mine. The upper 17 miles of the Alamosa River have been killed off by heavy metals and cyanide. And if you go downriver into the San Luis Valley, down the Alamosa, that's the river that all the big canals come off of to water farms, to water livestock. And I find it interesting that back in 1997, there was a West Wind magazine out of Denver had an expose about an EPA scientist who was raising livestock on the Alamosa River to make sure that their test results were showing that there wasn't heavy metals that was showing up in the lower portion of the river, the upper 17 miles being polluted. Well, what do? They raise the animals for 90 days, and then what do they do to them? They kill them, and they do workups on their organs, and they do workups on the blood and other types of scientific testing to gauge the impact of their environment on the animals. Well, when he found out that there was 300 to 600 times the amount of heavy metals, this scientist named Brian Rimmer, he freaked out, and he went to his bosses and said, "Hey, who's going to write the press release, you guys or me?" And they said, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "Well, we got to warn all these ranchers in the San Luis Valley that their water source is polluted, and these animals that I raised shouldn't even be alive. They should be dead." And they said, "Well, you're not going to write anything." And he said, "Okay, well, put me together with whoever is going to write it." And they said, "Nobody's going to write it." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "We don't want to alarm people." And he immediately quit his job, went to West Wind, which is a free, kind of an investigator newspaper in Denver that gets handed out free every week. Yeah. And he did a whistleblower. Mea culpa, basically, with the magazine. Well, isn't it interesting that in 1997, in 1998, my 7 mutilation cases that I had all happened on the Alamosa River. Wow. So getting back to my point, we are seeing what appears to be an environmental monitoring program. They're monitoring the environment with the soft tissue organs of livestock. They can find everything from heavy metals, gold, for instance, oil, and they can find the how badly the environment has been trashed by the above ground radiation from 1,000 nuclear tests. So that's about as close as you're going to get to somebody coming out and saying, "I know why they're mutilating cattle." I'm not saying that this is completely 100% real and true, but if I had to place my money, if somebody said you have to bet on a causal factor that's behind these cases, what would it be? And that would be my answer.
Because my question has always been, how much is military involvement in Black Access projects? And I mean, even Richard Doty, I know disinformation, I think he's coming back, but he said you need to FOIA the Air Force's agricultural office, which would speak to exactly what you're saying, Chris, that this is a covert military operation to monitor. We know the tight missile silos. I'm sure you looked into that. But what about all the other high strangeness things? How do you believe it's all 100% our own military testing this, or is there unusual? Because there's so many other strange things.
No, at the core, there is something high strange going on, right. And probably has been for thousands of years. We have some sort of undefined predator. It has existed alongside humankind for thousands of years. It claims any animal that for any reason ends up being sick lying on the ground. Those are the animals that are most often are, targeted. It's an ingenious modus operandi that mimics the scavenger action of nature on soon to be dead animals and dead animals. And it is probably the single biggest reason, if you look back through history, it's probably the single biggest cause and rationale for the practice of animal sacrifice among humans. I think the book Brain Trust should be required reading by any rancher. It was written by the guy who was heading up the OSOP program for the Pentagon, Colm Kelleher. It is an incredibly important book that is totally, he didn't even sell his first printing. He probably sold only a few thousand copies.
Oh, wow.
He laid out the link between the cattle mutilation phenomenon and what we now know of as a dramatic increase in dementia deaths in this country, Alzheimer and other dementia deaths, and the connection between those types of maladies and mad cow disease or prion disease. And so if you combine your question about who's behind this, I think the military is probably, and to a lesser extent, but I think as importantly, the beef industry has been monitoring cattle herds in this country and in South America for the dreaded outbreak of prion disease, 100% fatal. It swept through cattle herds in England from 1986 to 1996. And then hoof and mouth disease broke out. And when hoof and mouth disease broke out, they said, okay, that's it. We are destroying 4.5 million cattle in the British Isles. Every single head of livestock will be killed and burnt, which is what they did. And it took 2 years, 1994 to 96, to burn them all, kill them and burn them all. And at the time, they didn't know what was causing what we now know as prion disease. The actual discovery of prions, the discoverer was awarded the medical Nobel Prize in 1998. Well, at the time, they didn't know that these things, you can't kill them. And so all that bone ash was filled with prions. Prions can live in the soil for 5 years before they go dormant. They can cross the species barrier. In other words, you can be a hunter, eat a deer with chronic wasting disease, and end up with prion disease. I had 6 people out of 150 approach me in St. Paul, Minnesota, my very first Stalking the Herd talk. And prion disease only breaks out naturally in 1 in a million people. That's the natural occurrence of it. I had 6 people come to me telling me about people that they knew that died of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which is the human variant. What are the odds? 6 people out of 150. They did a study, the University of Pennsylvania. They drew a circle around the school of 100 miles. This is back in the mid-90s. And they autopsied every dementia death within that circle. Normally, people who die of dementia, Alzheimer's, and related diseases that creates dementia-like symptoms, twitching of limbs, the sympathetic system forgets to tell itself to breathe, to do the metabolic function, pump the heart, have the lungs work, and people die. They twitch out and die. It's a horrible way to go. We're seeing thousands of times increase in deaths in this country right now from dementia. These students autopsied all the dementia deaths that normally would just be buried, out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. And almost 25% were dying of prion disease.
Hmm.
They were shut up. They were not allowed to publish. They weren't allowed to bring the, this horrific condition into the forefront of the public's mind, which
Wow.
the powers that be do control how the message is released in this country. And when you start digging around in these areas that Colm Kelleher and myself and others have been looking at, we wonder why we don't sell books. It's because people don't want to know. They really don't. I think there's a collective catharsis in this country where, people just don't want to know. And I think we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel with these cases that we've had recently with the cattle mutilation phenomenon in Oregon. We've had some in Kansas, some in Oklahoma, or at least one in Oklahoma. So this thing is starting to rear its ugly little head again. And I think we may be looking at a different response curve and a different mentality now with the new openness that the UAP rebranding has brought ufology. I think that we're going to see something similar in the UAD, or as I like to call them, unexplained animal deaths. I've been trying to get the mutilation researchers to rebrand their subjects so people will be willing to even listen about it and talk about it. But I have not having very much luck for some reason.
It recently with congressional hearings on your side of the border, guys, they're starting to hear truths that over 90 years now that the U.S. government has had possession of crafts that are not from us. They're not from here. They're from somewhere else. And they have bodies that they don't want to say aliens, to just say non-human entities. But it's proven now, he made an oath that he would tell the truth and that they do have possession of this, which is very interesting because 90 years is a long time for a military to have access to technologies and bodies and research it. And keeping this secret is probably their most expensive venture.
Yeah.
We know that Congress is missing over $1 billion every year whenever they get audited, right? Like it's where does the money go, right? So keeping the secret.
No, you got to add a big T on there, buddy.
Oh, it's trillion.
Remember on September 10th, 2001?
Yep.
When the results of the initial Department of Defense what's it called when they do the bookkeeping thing on it, an audit. The first thing Donald Rumsfeld did when he got in, January 2000, was audit the Defense Department. He wanted to know how much money he had, and so he made the big announcement that $4.2 trillion was not where it was supposed to be in the Department of Defense, and at 2.2 trillion was missing. Now, you know the difference between a million and a billion?
That's huge.
A million seconds is 13 days. A billion seconds is 31 years. How many minutes is a trillion? You could put a pile of $100 bills the size of a pallet all the way from the stairs of the Pentagon to the front door of the White House of $100 bills. I think 7 feet by 7 feet by 7 feet by 7 feet.
Yeah. But don't you think that would be a dead giveaway, guys, that follow the money? Like, that's all they have to do is like, where's the money going? Follow the money. Like, where does it end? Where's the, there's got to be a part where it just goes missing. And
Well, it's way more than $10,000 screwdrivers,
Yeah. But I mentioned this before. If it was the
$20,000
cartel,
toilet seats.
imagine you work for the cartel and you tell them that you're missing 2 point whatever trillion dollars of their money. What do you think happens to you? Right? You're missing that for an entire country and nobody's accountable for it. It's just, it's gone. Stop asking.
Yeah.
That to me is crazy. But with them addressing that UAPs are real, they eventually are going to have to start looking at the evidence of when these things, they're acknowledging that they're in the sky and that they're in the water, but they also have to acknowledge that these things have interactions with humans a lot more frequently than they are want, and that there's also evidence. So these things land, there's usually sometimes some evidence left behind. I don't know about the cattle mutilation, but that to me seems like a substantial, the ones that are real, seems like substantial evidence that they're interacting with.
Well, see, the real problem here is the whole idea of aliens and ETs. I have been saying for 40 years that they are as indigenous to this place as we are. And the reason why they showed up after we started popping off nuclear weapons was we were putting them in harm's way because they live here too. And when they showed up in the 40s and early 50s, they showed up en masse in huge flotillas. Okay, from 9 craft, the Kenneth Arnold event, to over 50 craft within 3 months. They were showing up in big flotillas. I mean, if that wasn't a wake-up call to our brand new Air Force, and that was probably one of the reasons why the Air Force was formed, was because of these flotillas of objects showing up and the Army being too inundated with work in order to take care of its business. So they had to spin off the Army Air Corps. They had to spin off the Air Force. And I find it almost cute the way everybody's falling into this ET extraterrestrial hypothesis. Like we're important enough for anything out there to come here, which to me is ludicrous.
So you're more on the ultra terrestrial aspect of things?
Oh, yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Crypto, ultra, meta.
Yeah, I think Hal Puthoff on that.
We're dealing with things that have a presence here and have probably been here longer than we have. They're probably more terrestrial than we have. And there's a chance that we were brought here.
Right. You make valid points. Katie, what do you think?
I've been really, I'm curious to ask Christopher what he thinks about our ability to manifest or interact with the phenomenon and bring it to fruition ourselves, especially the more high strangeness types of activity. Do you believe that we have the ability to do that?
I don't believe any of this.
Of it?
I don't believe any of this. I never use the word believe for any way, in any way, shape, or form, unless I really believe it.
Well, what is your opinion on it?
My opinion is that there's way more going on in this closed system place. When I say closed system, I mean, besides the occasional transpermia of mushroom spores maybe drifting here, I think that we are pretty much in a closed system. Everything we do kind of impacts and affects what's here, and I think one of the things that we are missing out on in this closed system examination of our wonderful apartment building is that there's other tenants in the building. And they're probably suboceanic. I think there's definitely going to be a group there, because the Office of Naval Intelligence may have been formed in the 1880s because we got our first glimpse of them. That's why that's the oldest intelligence agency by 100 years in this country almost, is the Navy, because they found out about something early on. And you don't hear about that very much, but there was a couple of events that happened in the 1880s. An event that happened, I think, in 1919, where strange submerged craft all of a sudden flew away. That's enough to, you know, back in, the days of the Titanic, that would have been a little bit disturbing. So, like for instance, cryptids. I love cryptids, but if you start looking at the areas of high incidence for Bigfoot, for instance, you'll always find a cave system. Now, how come nobody knows that? And the people that do know, why don't they use that information and maybe go somewhere with it? I think that the fact that we've only explored 2% of our oceans. I mean, we know way less about the bottom of the Pacific than we do about some of the furthest galaxies in the sky. And I mean, how many people have been to the bottom of the Marianas Trench? I think it's only James Cameron. More people have been on the moon than have been to the bottom of the Pacific. Or the bottom trenches. So, yes, you want to say crypto, ultra, and then of course there's some sort of dimensional thing going on as well. I'm convinced. That's where I would place my money in Vegas. I would not place it on extraterrestrials at this point. I don't think we're important enough to warrant that kind of attention and that kind of expenditure of resources that it would take to get here.
Yeah, I would think that one thing too, that looking into the cattle mutilations, and this is something that we brought up before we started the podcast, is that recently, Chris, you were on Tucker Carlson, and you finally addressed what we should be addressing, which is it's not just the cattle being mutilated, it's different animals, and most importantly, humans as well, right? Which is scary. That's the scary bit about this whole phenomenon. This is why we want to cover it as much as we can on the podcast, because this gets into the scary bits of what disclosure may look like, is that we don't know if these things are on our side or not, but humans have been found in horrible conditions similar to these cattles, and it seems like it's an instant death by the looks of it. Everything happens all at once with these cows or these humans. It seems horrible, and it happens, I don't know how fast, but they must move very fast.
Well, it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to investigate.
The human aspect.
It's human mutilations, yeah. And Don Ecker, who started UFO Magazine and was a homicide detective in Pennsylvania, he spent 3 years trying to get to the bottom of how many cases that we have, and he insisted that I publish his report in my book, Stalking the Herd, so people can see how difficult it is to, even as a law enforcement official, to investigate these cases, and that there are cases that need to be investigated.
Big time. Yeah.
Fortunately, I've only had one report, and it actually got me in trouble, even trying to make some phone calls about it to the New Mexico State Patrol. Supposedly there was a 14 to 16-year-old girl. I didn't get her exact age, but she was between 14 and 16. Was found in a mutilated condition in Silver City, New Mexico. This came from a very reputable source, and I was slam dunked. Every door, phone, window was slammed in my face. Every phone call I made was, do not press this. Do not, I am not going to even, I had one cop who I knew tell me he wasn't even going to answer my question, and that I should really start thinking about some other investigative things that I had on my plate, that this was the last one that you should be looking at.
So was it somebody beat you to the punch, Chris? Like, did somebody beat you to the punch? You like got to them before you did?
Yeah, the State Patrol, New Mexico State Patrol did. And there may be some other, governmental entity that's involved as well. I know in England there is. The work of Richard T. Hall. I mean, he's even come up with some autopsy photographs and other things that are very difficult to disagree with or debunk. And there is not sure if it's SAS, but I seem to recall that there's a secret branch of SAS that are like saucer recovery teams here. These are human mutilation respondents there. And Hall has actually gotten some whistleblowers who have come forward with some files and have come forward with some of the inner workings of this particular team. And if the Brits got one, we got one. So,
do you think these are possibly connected with David Pilates missing 411 cases as well? These human mutilations?
There's a really high likelihood, yes. There's a very high likelihood. People don't understand how many people go missing in this country a year. He's only dealing with national parks, okay?
Yeah, right.
I remember back in the 80s, I read some article that I literally followed up. I called the paper and said, was this a misprint? And they said no. They claimed that over 10,000 kids were missing from Westchester County in 1 year.
What?
And I was like, well, this can't be true. And they said, well, lots of parents out there, which is true. There's a lot of, tug of war between breaking up families and stuff. But in one county, 10,000?
Don't drink the water. Yeah.
No. And Westchester, I mean, come on, that's high rent district too. I mean, some of the richest individuals in this country live in Westchester, and two ex-presidents, Keith Richards, right over the border, and which would be Connecticut. That whole area of the world is like, I mean, that's high rent district there, boy. And to have that many people missing,
that's terrifying.
I'd have to go re-look up the number, but I'm pretty sure it was 10,000 that I saw.
And are you hypothesizing then that perhaps they're coming out from underground, under our oceans, grabbing and taking them underground?
I'm not sure. I really, I've not been able to put together enough of a statistical database or enough, I've just, it's one of those I don't want to deal with. Kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Scary, right?
I mean, I've really, I got warned off it pretty strongly early on, and I mean, if I can get to the bottom of the cows, that's going to be great, because then I'll have an excuse to go after the people. But I really admire David Pilates' work. I was so grateful that he invited me to speak at his very first conference. I was amazed by that. But yeah, there's a lot more bumps in the night than I think the average person is aware of. There's a lot of things that are going on in this reality that are disturbing, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. And you know what? Like, even the stories that we hear, I think there's one on Netflix. It was on Unsolved Mysteries. I think it's Berkshire incident, where this UFO was going from basically town to town, taking people, and then brought them back. But it was mostly kids that it was taken. It took a family, and it's pretty interesting. But
the Tom Reed.
Yes, Tom Reed. Yeah, the Reed family. Absolutely. I think they're doing another documentary on it as well.
Very well documented case.
Yeah, but one of the things that struck me is that he was saying one of the he was a young boy. He was at a friend's house coloring, and he could hear it clearly in his head, go outside. You need to go home. Go home. And it was this drive, like he had to do it. And then once he gets outside, of course, they nab him. What scares me is the ability to think, the ability of your consciousness, the control factor that we do not have. And a lot of people say that during abductions, they don't have any control over their faculties. They have full control. That's the scary bit. Because even with these animals, if they're being taken, they're in full control of that animal. That animal no signs of protest. Try to kill a cow, the way that these things are killed, and see how much blood and
Well,
damage you end up
we've had
with.
some cases where the animal has been very
Adamant, yeah, I'm not
adamant
dying.
not to get taken.
Yeah.
We had a case, just amazing case in northern New Mexico. A bear hunter gotten permission to hunt on a guy's ranch, and he came to a group of cattle in the back end of the pasture, and all of a sudden he heard one start honking. It just started screaming, and he watched as it was dragged 6 inches off the ground, dragged backwards up the hill into a thicket. Well, he was so freaked out by this, he fired his .30-06 or whatever into the thicket to try to save the cow. And it was then he heard there was a bright flash, and he heard the sound of what he called like a giant arc welder. You know how an arc welding torch will
Right.
sound, and it freaked him out. He went immediately to the rancher's house, brought him back up there. They found where the drag marks where the animal had been dragged, and then the ditch it had been dragged over, not touching the ground. And they found where it had been dragged into the thicket, and it was mutilated, and whatever it was that did it was gone.
What was it being
Broad
drugged
daylight.
by? It was just they didn't see what was dragging it. It was just
No. No, some invisible force was dragging the cow, screaming and hollering backwards.
You're
up the
saying
hill.
dragging, but you're saying it's above the ground, like it's floating above the ground.
The cow was on the ground, but then it was levitated over a part where the ground dropped away in a ditch, and it went over the top of the ditch, not touching the ground.
Right.
Wow.
And then once it got back to the ground level again, it was being dragged on the ground. But the guy said he saw it being levitated over this particular, like a ditch or an arroyo or something.
Oh, that's creepy.
Wow.
I wonder if it's screaming the whole time, or if at some time it gets cut off, like it can't do screaming anymore. Like that creeps me out.
I'd have to go check my notes on that.
Yeah.
The guy's name, I remember, Larry Gardia. I'll never forget that case because I tried my damnedest to get there, but Linda cut me off. He would not talk to anybody but Linda, and he only talked to her twice. And oh well.
So I had
it was one of those few cases that I really wanted to talk to the rancher, and no, I wasn't good enough.
Oh no.
I have another question. I have so many questions. I could talk to you for hours, honestly. But one question, and I've only done a handful of interviews. I've gone on location and interviewed some of these ranchers. And you've done thousands through the years. So something that one of my witnesses from the Clearview, Elbert County case, now her family kind of pioneered the area in 1978. She moves to Rama. Rama, Colorado is just right on the border of Elbert County. And
Right.
She was talking about an incident. She had a very mysterious incident with a dead calf that was, had 4 incisions. Top of the fur was removed. Skin was still there, goes back. Long story short, 25 minutes later, that calf is completely mutilated, cauterized, blood drained, no track marks, miles off the county road, and so forth. But she had mentioned that the ranchers, because, when you're in these small communities, all the ranchers, they're friends, they know each other, it's a pretty tight group. And she had mentioned to me that in the pastures where the mutilations were occurring, the cattle were mostly huddled together and calmer. And in the adjoining pastures, they were all freaked out. Now, has that been true in your research? Have you seen patterns like that or not so much?
No, there is no really. I don't think there's any rule of thumb. Here's an interesting case for you. This was very good because it was my brother had this happen to him.
Wow.
He and a buddy were going to do some logging up on, way up high at 10,000 feet and down in the mountains surrounding the San Luis Valley. And, the two of them were just wild and crazy guys. And, they left about 8 a.m. And as they drove up towards Coachella Pass, they did the turn to go up to where the logging area was, and they saw a mutilated cow right there in the pasture. The pasture kind of came down to the road. It was very narrow. It had a creek running through it. So there was enough room on just on this one part to get around to the backside of the creek, because there was a fence all around it. But the mutilated cow was blocking the path. So all the cows in the herd, they said it was about a dozen cows, were all crammed up against the fence to be as far away from the mutilated cow as they could get, and they were really not having a good time. And so now only guys tripping on a microdose of LSD would come up with this particular way to deal with it, but they had each gobbled like an eighth or something because they heard that Timothy Leary had died that day, and it just seemed to be the thing to do. Eat some ass and go logging. They were able to somehow zero in on what was wrong, what was going on with the cows, and the cows just wanted to get by this thing. And so he went and he mooed in such a way that made them feel calm, and each mother and baby, he would moo them close to the mutilated cow, and then they'd run by it and run up into the rest of the pasture, which is probably, I don't know how many square miles. And he did this for all 13 mamas and babies. And he said, look, if I hadn't been on that, if I hadn't gobbled that little bit of acid, no way would I have even thought about doing that, let alone being able to do it. And he and my brother took photos of him mooing the cows by and giving them permission to go ahead, saying, it's okay, mama, you can do it. And there was a couple times where the mama, she would go, but the calf wouldn't, and she would have to go back, and then she would be even extra scared. And they said it took about an hour to get all these cows over. And he took photographs, and they'd been out on quite a number of cases with me by that point. And so when they came back down the hill that night, they saw the cows, way in the distance up in the rest of the pasture. It was a huge ranch, and this was just the point of it. And they went and they saw the cow was gone. The mutilated animal was gone. The mama that
not easy to move.
They
a
never
cow.
did see a baby from it. And it was all mamas and babies at that point. That would have been the 13th one, I think. 13th mama and baby. There were a dozen that they mooed by.
So do you have a theory on what makes the animals react to, let's say, that cow being mutilated? Did they see something they're traumatized, or is there a scent? Or
yeah, I think that they were there when it happened. And I think that they were also aware that the baby was gone. I think the baby also helped their fear. The mournful moo, my very first case, where I was actually there on site with a mutilated cow. I was interviewing a ranch who had lost 49 head in 2 weeks. They were shot, stolen, or mutilated, and they were done by an adjoining ranch that was trying to drive them out of business. And so I was interviewing this guy, and his phone rang while they had cameras rolling, right?
Yeah.
Ring. He picks up the phone and he goes, yeah, he's still here. And he says, okay, interview's over. We're going to go see a live one or a dead one, a fresh one. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, I told my nephews, they've had some cases here recently, and I told them that I was going to be doing an interview with you. And he just called me and told me they had a fresh one. He went out, it was pretty early at that point. It was just after 9. So he'd gone out, and he found one of his animals had been mutilated the night before. So we raced over there. And by the time I got there, there was probably 6 or 7 other ranchers there, all pretty worried and ticked off. These were all Hispanic, 5th generation Hispanic ranchers, some of the oldest bloodlines of cattle in North America. And they're all standing around, and we're looking at this, poor cow. It was underneath some trees. And all the way at the other end of the pasture, probably 500 or 600 yards away, was the rest of the herd. And there was probably, I don't know, 40 or 50 of them. It's been so long, I forget. But we went through and I did the whole investigation. I found this yellowish, like orange marmalade stuff that I sent to a hematologist in Denver. And, I put it in a film container and wrapped it up and signed it and everything. And by the time it got there, it had totally disappeared. There was not even a trace of it in the canister. The only thing that had ever been in there, according to the hematologist, was film. But I digress. We gathered this material. I took video. My batteries ran out because I had already gone through most of them with the interview. And so I wasn't able to film this, and I'm so pissed. All this time, the big mama cow, the big matriarch cow of the herd, was slowly making its way over. The more people showed up, the more comfortable it was, and the closer it got. None of the other animals would come anywhere near it. They were way on the other side of the pasture. Finally, I was rummaging around in my truck. The ranchers had walked away from the animal somewhat. It was there, lying under the trees by itself. That big old cow came over and sniffed at it. Finally, made the last little bit of a journey, and it started going moo, the most mournful moo that you could possibly ever hear. And it stuck its head up in the air. It was moo. I mean, it brought tears to your eye. And then it started slowly pawing at the ground around its head, and it started going in a counterclockwise motion, pawing at the ground. And as it started doing this, every head of cattle in that pasture came thundering over. And it wasn't mamas and babies. It was all mature cows. And they started all pawing at the ground, raising their heads and mooing and going around the animal in counterclockwise. And I'm sitting there begging my batteries, please, just give me 5 seconds. And I look, and I would have given the 5 seconds just to have the row of ranchers standing there watching this with their mouths wide open, just flabbergasted. And I said, have you ever seen cows do this? Have you ever seen cows do this? We don't even think cows can do this. Wow. That was their response was, well, we didn't even know cows did this. What do you mean have I ever seen this?
That's crazy.
My first case, I was hooked.
Yeah, I bet. No, well, actually, we're going to wrap it up pretty soon. But Katie, I was wondering, with your work that you've done recently,
I just ate up all our time.
No. Well, we'll definitely have you on again. We got to do part 2. But I was recently in a vehicle with 2 police officers. I'm not going to explain why. I wasn't arrested or anything, but I asked them. I said, "Hey, I investigate UFOs, and I have a podcast on it. I'm like, what's the standard procedure for the RCMP in British Columbia? It's a RCMP that basically polices us." And he said, "Oh, well, we would just show up and take notes, and I guess that's it." I'm like, "Okay, but you wouldn't contact NORAD or like, there's absolutely no procedures in policing about this issue." And I think as this issue is coming forward, and that it's going to become more mainstream, obviously, at some point, police officers are going to have to be trained. If you think about the amount of cases that police officers are involved in, not just from cattle mutilations, but from actually seeing crafts to seeing entities. What was it? The Socorro, New Mexico, Lonnie, whatever his name is, Zamora, or whatever. Yeah. He's, seen entities. So the police officers are very much part of this. And we need them to come on record as well, because there's many of them have had sightings and amazing cases that it just goes silent. Nobody talks about in the police force. It's like, again, another taboo subject. In your opinion, Katie, what do we need to do to bring that to light?
Well, I think these hearings are helping that, and the whistleblower protection is going to help with that a little bit. But these small towns, and Chris knows this, they stay tight-lipped. They don't want the publicity. And in fact, that's one of the things when I just recently on Beyond Skinwalker, I went and revisited the ranch for the first time since I was a young girl, and just going to the town of Elbert and meeting some of the locals, I was surprised to find out that these things are still occurring to this day. They're just not reported. And did you find that too, Christopher, that these are still going on? And that surprised me a little bit in all the activity we had at the ranch. I thought, the height of all that was 75 to 79. I thought things really slowed down. It slowed down to a degree, but still to this day, there's people reporting high strangeness. So I think what helps is, you mentioned police officers, the undersheriff Bill Waugh, George Yarnell. I think they were talked to by Air Force, by NORAD, to not report on these mutilations so much, and they were given directives to downplay what's happening, just like with the human mutilations. So until that changes, we're not going to see police officers speaking up more because they're taking orders from somebody else to downplay it. So something needs to change, a step beyond them, who's ever telling them to downplay it.
Yeah, and I also found too that longtime investigators in an area will inure themselves to the local law enforcement and to the ranching and farming communities to the extent where you're trusted. And oftentimes what they would do is, when there was a report come in, the cop would go out and say, yep, this is a real one. Then they come back and they'd immediately call me. And then it got to the point where they wouldn't even do that anymore. They just have my number there at the dispatch desk. And they would call me up and say, hey, it looks like we have another one. Could you go check this out for us? And I even had my best, most just mind-blowing abduction case came from the dispatch desk of the local county sheriff.
Okay, well, now you have to share that one. There's no way we can let you go without hearing that one.
So it does work both ways. If you have people that are trusted in the community that are doing work, who are working with veterinarians, who are working with law enforcement, like Chuck Zukowski, he's getting to the point now where he's been doing this long enough where people trust him, and he can actually get on site soon enough so that he's has recourse. If you're not there within the time for a pretty narrow time window, you're not going to be able to do anything.
Right.
And ranchers and farmers know this, so you have to be there in a timely manner.
Yeah, it's an investigation, right? It's like a fresh corpse, so you got to treat it that way.
And then
right?
you can maybe hire a vet to go out and do a necropsy.
That's the way to do it. Okay, tell us about this abduction, if that's okay. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how these things work. Well, it's a pretty long story.
Well, we can always keep it for part two. Keep that in mind. We always have something for part two.
It's a good cliffhanger.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's got a lot of peculiarities to it.
I love me good abduction stories. I'm a sucker for them. I really am.
Yeah, well, this one was. I'll leave you with this one. It was all positive. It was not a negative experience. It was third generation. Her daughter it was starting to happen to her. It had happened to the woman's grandmother, and she had an ET lover. And he would really turn her on, and she loved it when he wore his gold May cape because it reminded her of Elvis.
So this takes place back in the day or like recent times?
This was in the 90s. This is 20 years after he died.
That's crazy. Okay, well,
but
we
she
got
loved
something
it
for
when he would dress, and he knew that she liked it because he would, on special occasions, he would wear his gold May cape.
Da-na-da,
And she had to get a post office box in town because the Blues Brothers were showing up stealing her mail, and they wouldn't hide. They would just stand there at the end of her mail, 150-yard driveway, in their old, brand new Cadillac. And she said, I swear to you, it was the Blues Brothers. They were rifling through my mail, and they kept doing it.
This should be your next book.
That should be.
It's
the
there.
other
It's
book.
in-
This is the book.
It's in
by Dan Aykroyd,
Secrets of the
right?
Mysterious
Yeah.
Valley. It's my abduction
it?
chapter. It's
Okay.
that whole case.
Well, you know what? This subject, like I said, has so many layers and depths. And the cattle mutilation for me has always been my abduction for me is my number one subject I love to study. And then the other one is the cattle mutilation, just because I find it so fascinating. Christopher, where can we find your work, and where can people reach out to you if they need to reach out to you?
Well, I do have a website that unfortunately was frozen for a long time, and I just got it all unfrozen, but it hasn't been updated in a while. But there's a ton of good stuff on there. It's Our Strange Planet. We live in a strange planet. It's Our Strange Planet.
Yeah, that's a good name.
And then other than that, I'm all over the internet. There's got to be 20 or 30 podcasts, radio shows, TV show stuff that's online. So I'm coming up I'm coming full circle. My very first show I did was Unsolved Mysteries back in '93. They've come back around. They're doing me again. So.
Nice.
And they're the ones that gave me some information on the Oregon, the recent Oregon mutilation cases. So that's a full hour. It's going to be very interesting. They intellectually, I was out there a couple of weeks ago, and they sucked me dry. I mean, I don't think I've ever done a 6-hour interview before.
Oh, wow.
Man, they must be getting ready to do other shows or something too. Because they chew me up and spit me out.
I miss
Colin
Robert
Cullen, good
Stacks. Remember Robert Stacks?
Yeah, good
the
old
host?
Bob Stack. Yeah,
Hey, I love that guy's voice. I
yeah,
always
yeah. He was. I was on one of the very first shows.
yeah,
I think the third season.
that's awesome. And Katie, do
Third
you
or
have
fourth.
anything coming up? Like what projects are you working on right now?
Actually, I don't know if I got good news. I'll just put it that way. I got good news just yesterday in an email that there's going to be some new projects coming up, and hoping to get out on the ranch and do some work with some teams. So a few things coming up, but working heavy on this ranch book so I can share all this research that I found out there. So I'm still working on that, and you can find me at katiepaige.net. So
Nice. And you know what? I really think you should do a documentary, at least start documenting, your investigations, your travels, all that, because that would be a very interesting film. And I think, you're so active that you should do that. That's something that you should do,
thank
right?
you.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
actually considering a project just like that. It's just
Yeah.
kind of on the
Yeah,
trail or
Tony'd
on
be
the
great to
hunt.
help out on that. He's
Right.
he's
That's
a
a
good
good
guy with
point.
a camera.
Yeah. And you could film your daily diaries and then select from that what, panned
Go
out
on the
is good,
field with
right?
me and do interviews with me. I'll just take the
There
camera
you go.
along with me, see how it's done. Because you really
Exactly.
need to get out there face
Yeah.
to face. You can't sit at home and do it. Even
Yeah.
on Zoom and podcasts are wonderful, but until you sit with somebody face to face in their living room and you're out there on their property,
Yep.
that's where you need to be.
No
Completely
substitute.
different. Yeah. I haven't done that in since I started the podcast. I've been so busy doing this,
Right.
but I would love to do that. And I keep encouraging people to reach out, of course, if they need help.
Where exactly in Canada are you?
I'm in Chilliwack, British Columbia, so just outside Vancouver.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I grew up in
Beautiful
Washington
location.
State. I spent a lot of time up around that area.
Yeah, I'm surrounded by mountains. Like I really
yeah,
live
it's
in
gorgeous
a
there.
gorgeous area for sure.
That's Main Street Bigfoot country, boy.
Yep,
Gonna
Harrison
say
Hot
that.
Springs is just right around the
Yep.
corner, and that's
Yeah,
covered in Bigfoot.
I was there
for
a year
sure.
to the day after the big event happened.
Nice.
Amazing. Yeah, the old Silverback when he jumped in there, and that would have been 78 when he chased everybody out of the hot springs.
It's crazy though. Like the natives in the area, definitely they're like, dude, they're
Oh, yeah.
here. Like we hear them all the time. I'm like, okay, that's crazy. But yeah, I appreciate both your times today, Katie. This was awesome. We got to do this again. And
Yeah.
Christopher, let's have you back on. Let's do a
Sorry
number
for
two.
not
of this.
monopolizing the hour.
No. This is great. And that you got so much
Wind me up, I
knowledge.
get
It's
going.
impossible to narrow it down in an hour, right? It's
Yeah.
impossible. But that's the point of this podcast, is to learn from people like yourselves, so we can know more in-depth information, more than what's being put out there, right? And it's super important. And I believe in everybody having a voice and saying what they need to say, right?
Cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. With that,
Thank you,
we'll
Jason.
cue the music and we'll
Okay.
head on out.
Great seeing you again.
Great,
Take
great
care,
seeing you
guys.
too. Thanks, Chris.